NWP Radio.
You're listening to NWP Radio, a production of the National Writing Project.
NWP. NWP Radio.
Welcome, everyone, to April's author conversation for the 2021 Marginal Syllabus. The Marginal Syllabus is a project that convenes and sustains equity conversations in the margins of texts online using the social annotation tool Hypothes.is. I'm Joe Dillon from the Denver Writing Project. I teach English at Gateway High School in Aurora, Colorado, and I'll be your host for the conversation. We have a panel here to discuss this month's reading, which is titled Revealing the Human and the Writer, the Promise of a Humanizing Writing Pedagogy for Black Students. It's by Latrise Johnson and Hannah Sullivan. So I'd like to ask our guests to introduce themselves before we start talking about this piece.
All right. Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I am Latrise Johnson. I'm an associate professor of English language arts and literacy at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. I'm also professor in residence at West High School, which is a local high school here in Tuscaloosa. And I teach classes, usually teaching methods. I do some doctoral classes and graduate level courses in literacy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hillary Walker. I am currently teaching African American Studies, primarily history courses for the College of Alameda, and my main role is as the director of the Bay Area Writing Project. Very excited to be here.
My name is Remi Kalir. I'm an assistant professor of learning design and technology at the University of Colorado in Denver. And I'm also one of the co-founders and facilitators of the Marginal Syllabus. And I'm just so thrilled to be here and so thankful to have both Latrise and Hillary in conversation with us today.
Yeah, thanks everyone for that. And so as we get ready to discuss this article, I'd love to have Latrise, who was kind enough to grant us permission to read this in a public space and join us today to discuss it. I'd love it if you would provide some background that you think readers might find interesting, or anything that you think is important for us to understand before we discuss it.
All right, thank you so much. So this article, and mostly all of the articles I write, actually come out of my position as professor in residence at the local high school here. I'm one of them. And when I first got my assistant professor job at UA, I was very lonely, very isolated. I know you all know how it is. And I just did not feel like I was doing the work I should have been doing. I was a former teacher. I had taught in Atlanta Public Schools for 6 years. I also attended Atlanta Public Schools. And so there was something in me that needed more. I knew that sitting in an office, writing articles just wasn't going to be enough. And so, you know, after some hoop jumping and whatnot, I found myself at it's a high school here that serves a predominantly African-American population, and it's a mile away from our campus. And so I had a conversation with the principal, and he was very welcoming, and he was like, come to the school, you know, do what you want. And that kind of just turned into this kind of professor in residence thing that I talk about, where I started off just observing, just kind of hanging out at the school, meeting people, saying hey to the students. They would be asking, you know, who are you? What are you doing here? And then I started to establish relationships with the administration, with teachers, with students, with families. I've been cheerleading coach there. I've been flag corps co-sponsor, PTA president, because after being there for a year, I moved my daughter, who was going to another high school, to the school too. So I just felt like the space was just so affirming for who I was and, what I believed as a Black scholar. And so just one of the semesters, I had this bright idea to go to the principal and ask him if I could teach a class. And I wanted to really be able to say to the teachers, to the pre-service teachers that I was, who were in my class, that I know that this stuff works. But I had only been resting on or relying on my experiences as a teacher in Atlanta. And I didn't know for sure if this stuff still worked, And so I wanted to just test out my teaching legs. So I did. And I ended up teaching a semester-long creative writing course. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It was, a whole bunch of kids, and they were just kind of throwing kids into the class. But it ended up being just such a great and generative space for me. And so that class is where I kind of come to this article, and where I use their stories, their writing, and our experiences together to really formulate this idea of a humanizing writing pedagogy for Black students.
Thank you so much. And I think one question I have for you is it seems like first of all, you have a co-author who isn't here today, but we also want to thank Hannah Sullivan. And maybe you could just speak a little bit about her role in helping you gather some data, or maybe even imagine this piece.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Hannah was my graduate assistant during the semester I kind of came to the work. And I wanted to make sure that I was seeing and interpreting the data, right, for what it was. And so I wanted to invite someone else to help me make sense of what I was doing as a teacher. Like, I know my stance, I know the theories that inform, kind of what I think I'm doing, right? But I kind of used her knowledge and her expertise to really think through how to formulate an argument around this sort of teaching for students. So she really was a part of making sense of the data and making sure, kind of like checking me on some of the things that I may have been concluding because of my subjectivity, because I am not neutral in any of this, and not suggesting that she is, but she was helpful in talking through, reflecting on what I thought I was seeing and what I thought I was doing. So she was very key in helping me interpret the data, and also locating relevant literature for supporting this work. And she's defended her dissertation now, so she's Dr. Sullivan. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that thorough introduction to the piece. And thanks again to Dr. Sullivan for also granting us permission to read and discuss this work in public. So before we jump into a discussion of the work, though, I'd like to ask Remi to just say a little bit about the project that brings us all here, so we have the context for this conversation before we get into it.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And again, Latrise, thank you. And please, again, do pass our thanks along to Hannah. I also wanted to just say a belated congratulations on the award that the both of you received from NCTE for this piece. And so for folks who, again, are either watching or listening to this recording at some point, or who then again read the article as it's appeared as openly available online. Is it the Purvis Award? Is that correct, Latrise? Is that right?
Yes, LNC Purvis Award. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just again, like the Vanguard Award from NCTE for an article appearing in the Research of Teaching and Education, and just so honored that we can again feature your scholarship in this kind of way, which really brings us to the core purpose of a project like the marginal syllabus, which is, again, to Latrise, to quote you from just a moment ago, you said, this stuff works. And we know that these types of powerful humanizing pedagogies are so important, not only for educators to practice, but of course to inform the ways in which students, as you were saying in your piece, kind of write themselves into the world and into their own narratives in critically important ways. And the marginal syllabus is a project that just helps, in some small, humble way, connect educators and their practices to this type of high quality, award-winning scholarship. And so we bring together communities of educators to read work, again, like the piece that we're engaging with this month, and then to also annotate it. And so the marginal syllabus takes a very expansive interpretation of notions of marginality. One is to engage with marginal kind of counter narratives to dominant inequitable narratives about American schooling. And certainly in the piece that we're reading and discussing this week, there are very important ways in which countering deficit narratives around the writing abilities and the academic interests of students is core to some of what you've helped to, again, bring forth in your work. But also, in addition to this aspect of conversation, moving for folks who choose to do so, the conversation into online spaces where we can literally mark up the article and have a conversation in the digital margins. And we do so, again, using a free open source technology called Hypothes.is in this case. But that's another venue, another location where educators can gather together asynchronously on their own terms to read and discuss this article. And then the last interpretation of marginality in this respect concerns really a reimagining of what counts as educator learning, and that there's a need for learning that occurs kind of in the margins of formal, dare I say, PD, where we know that there are many didactic mandated approaches to what counts as educator professional development. And this project, thanks to its partners, again, including the National Writing Project and the National Council of Teachers of English and Hypothes, is trying to, in some small way, provide another pathway for professional learning that is justice directed, and that is, in the case of this 2021 syllabus, explicitly oriented to supporting the work of Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter at Schools Coalition to advance that year of purpose in classrooms, and specifically in literacy classrooms. And so that's what brings this project together. And it is, at the end of the day, only possible because of the scholars, again, like Latrise, you, thank you again so much, and to Hannah, and also to our readers and educators, in this case, Hillary, and the networks I know that you are connected to, who are coming together to read and engage with these texts. And so this project is only possible because of the time and attention that is given to us by amazing colleagues. So I'm rambling because I'm really just so inspired by the folks who are with us today and the work. I'll leave my commentary there, and I really look forward to on just digging into this article and talking about it.
Terrific, thanks, Remi. And so, so where we're headed now is really an informal conversation where I know all of us have some notes that we've brought. When I read these pieces for the marginal syllabus, I often make notes in the margins using pen and paper before I use the technology to do so. And so I imagine Hillary has notes and things on her mind, and Remi does as well. So I'm curious, Hillary, is there anything that stood out to you in particular, or any burning thoughts or reflections you have about this piece that can start off our conversation?
Sure. I mean, there's so much, but if I could start with one, I just thought about the expansiveness that this work invites in terms of thinking about genre. I liked the phrase linguistic registers. Like, what are the ways that we are asking students to engage with texts, with each other and each other's texts? It just seems like this really interesting community that clearly was happening in this classroom. And I just wanted to sort of start off, I guess it's less of a question, with an appreciation for that, to be able to clearly identify like those elements of that classroom in a way that can be replicated, or at least invite thinking around it. So maybe I can start off with a question about how did you imagine this creative writing space beyond genre?
That's actually a great question. Thank you so much, Hillary. So I think a lot about place, and school as place is so important, and the relationship of school and Black students is just so complicated and so complex. But if you walk into schools and classrooms, you look around, and in many cases, it reflects a space where you don't necessarily belong as a Black person. You know, there are pictures of scholars who are white. There are pictures of presidents who are white, and usually men. If you go into a literature classroom, there's almost always a picture of Shakespeare, right? And so, you know, you walk into this space and nothing reflects who you are. And most importantly, it doesn't reflect the Black literate intellectual lineage that exists, and that is such an important part of American culture and American schools. And so it was very important to me that my students knew that school is a place that they belong, that it is a place where they are valued. And in the classroom, I was sure to make sure that they felt this, that the images of authors and, you know, artists were there. All the work that they did, even as high school students. I had students, I guess in 9th through 11th, maybe a couple of 12th graders, I can't remember now. But I was hanging up their work, you know, their pictures were in the classroom, their words occupied space on the board and everywhere. There was always a record of our learning together up on the walls. And so part of what I needed them to understand is that they come from a rich literate history where so many people, so many Black people have located themselves in all kinds of bodies of knowledge that they're just not privy to, and that schools don't necessarily reflect. And part of what we can do is start there, you know, de-white the space, you know, add some authors of color, and not just Zora Neale Hurston or Martin Luther King, you know, but other folks who have been writing since day one, you know. Phyllis Wheatley, her poem, she, you know, first published African-American woman, but a lot of this isn't reflected in how students see school, and it's unfortunate. And but we have the power to change the space up, to do something different. And so yeah, it isn't just about, you know, genre. Our literate identities are tied up in so many parts of our being every day, talking to each other, singing, joning or janking, whatever the word is for the region, right? You know, the dozens, I don't know, is it counting the dozens? No, throwing the dozens, whatever it is, I'm sorry. You know, okay. But just all of these things are so tied up in who we are as literate beings, and they should be reflected in our school, and where we're having to sit 8 hours, 9 hours a day. You know, I should be able to look up and see myself.
Yeah, if you don't mind me jumping in, as I take again like furious notes about this, there was a term towards the end of your paper that I'd been sitting with for a number of days since reading it, and I revisited this morning, and it may just now beginning to make some more sense to me given what you've said. The term that you used, if I'm not mistaken, was epistemic privilege. and the epistemic privilege of, again, the students that you were learning alongside. And so when you speak of locating their histories and identities, as you said, in this rich lineage of Black intellectual history, and then as you noted, being a kind of participant within this kind of broader body of knowledge, that body of knowledge is embodied. And it then perhaps embodies that kind of epistemic privilege that they have the incredible opportunity to continue to carry forward. In any case, I'm kind of just rambling here, but I'm trying to make, again, further sense of this beautiful term, epistemic privilege, that you helped make me aware of, and I'm having some further sense of what that means given your comments. Latrise, thank you.
So when I think about, the epistemic privilege that, our students come to school with, like, they know what they know. And also they have the capacity to know so much more. And I think it's up to, teachers and administrators and families and folks who are on the edge of school like me, to remind them of those lineages, of that legacy that has been, left for them, and that they are definitely a part of, even, when we think about students who are hesitant to participate in the sort of, literacies and book reading that we want them to do, or that, curriculum mandates or standards, so we have to remember, and we have to call them to remember that they are here, and that they know, and that they can do, and that this is their legacy, as well as interrupt some of our practices as teachers, interrupt this centering of particular texts that are, centered as, or created, or make us to think that there are some universal stories, right? If I have to listen to a discussion around The Great Gatsby, one more time, then I'm just like, but, that's a universal story, quote unquote, that we're supposed to all be able to connect to. And it's just not true. That we know this something is different about our existence, and it's okay. And we can lean on texts that reflect those differences.
I'm also wondering if you could talk about the inclusion of text specifically. So you mentioned centering Black authors in the work. And so I'm wondering about what that looks like when people are including Black authors, but not necessarily including practices. So if you could just talk about that a little, that'd be great.
Sure. So for me, it's not necessarily just about Black authors, right? Or Black literature or anything like that. It's just, it's text is always up for reading, whatever the text is. And it's also up for my reading as a Black person, your reading as a Black youth, your reading is, and so, while I do try to include all sorts of texts that reflect Black life, Black love, Black joy, all of these things, all texts are up for analysis, synthesis, interpretation. And so even if I used to tell my students that I want you to be able to hear a song, your favorite song, they could be rapping about, whatever, but I want you to be able to hear and interpret the text. I want you to hear the simile, know the metaphor, know why, make connections. And so you can do this with, all sorts of text, but also, with literature that has been left here for you. So much of our stories are reflected in autobiographies of Black folks, Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass. I don't want to just name men, but You know, they did write a lot of autobiography, but poetry by Black women. But so much of our life is reflected in here. And there's something that we can see about ourselves. And if we can't, then we can also appreciate the text for its beauty, for its fluency, for its music. And so it's the text for me, you know, is not just about bringing in Black authors, which is super important, but it's also understanding how to read a text as a Black person and being able to locate yourself in what you're reading. And sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. But knowing that you have a literature and a literate lineage, then you can take a Great Gatsby and say that doesn't relate to me, or I can't locate anything about me in that, which is fine, but I also can appreciate it for a textual thing. So definitely from Cardi B to Michael Jackson to James Baldwin, letting Black students know that the ways that we write, the ways that we sing, the ways that we put our experiences out there, the way that we move, they're all worth interpreting. They're all worth reading. They're all worth valuing. And that is usually the part that's missing. Like, you can read Black authors all day and not care or not really know what's happening. Or you can say, oh, we're going to read The Hate You Give because, you know, police brutality is a thing. But you never include texts where Black people are happy and joyful and going through like the complex everyday kind of life things, like going to the grocery store with mom, or, you know, so so while Black authors, yes, so very important, just the range and the different kinds of stories and text and nonfiction and scientific text, all of these things are welcome and up for interpretation and reading. Yeah, all texts are for grabs. It doesn't even matter. Let's read Up by Cardi B or whatever it is, you know, that the kids are listening to. Or The Bluest Eye, you know, so.
One of the things that I very much appreciate about this piece is the way you start off asking the reader to imagine an English classroom where you then describe some really some commonplace, modern, traditional instructional practices. And by the end of the piece, I really feel like the way, you know, the writing you've done attends to the choices you make as a teacher. I really feel like it started off with one narrative of how class works, how English class can work. And then the rest of the piece presents a counter narrative, in large part constructed through the choices of the teacher that are going against the traditional dominant grain of, you know, kind of what you were talking about in terms of like traditional curriculum demands, and then also traditional notions of, you know, what's important as a text and these notions of correctness. And so, you know, I very much appreciated the way you seems like you lay a little bit of a roadmap for interested teachers who also might want to make some choices against the, you know, sort of the dominant approaches to curriculum or instruction. And, you know, I guess my final thought about that is I really thought that when you were wrapping up that little vignette about imagine this classroom where these traditional things are happening, you said, this is a place where the students or the teachers aren't really engaging deeply with the content. So I wonder if you'd want to say anything about that, or maybe somebody else has notes, beyond my appreciation there.
Well, I can speak to it, and feel free to interrupt anyone with additional thoughts. Um, so part of being professor in residence for now 7, 8 years, I've established relationships with teachers, and I have been very conscious about not teacher bashing, not, talking too much trash about how teachers are in their classrooms, because I was there. I have been a teacher who, taught in a very impoverished area. State tests, were terrible, whatever. But I made mistakes, and I did my best. So part of, being there for all that time and knowing the teacher, like knowing that she means the very best for her students, but still also critiquing, having a relationship with her in a way where I could critique, like, what are we doing? What is happening in here? Like, how can we push a little more? So being able to witness, right, and remember not only what it means to be a teacher in a space like this, but a student. And so I think of that vignette and I remember it so vividly because I was just sitting there, like, wanting more and, getting like close to it, but not nearly close enough. And so um, I'm just I'm grateful for, being able to be in that space and be a witness to what, the teacher was trying for her students, but also really thinking about how we can push our pedagogies in ways that really remind our students that they belong as a part of the conversation, that we're not just having these conversations around them, for them, making cliff notes about it, right? That they have something new and something important to add to this conversation. And so I find that writing is like the perfect way for us to locate how we fit in these conversations. Like, how do I fit in a glass castle, right? Where do I fit? But there just wasn't enough of that. And so, seeing that, but also talking back to the teacher, and also knowing in my heart what works and what is possible for Black students, I just had to try. I just had to get back in there and try and try again, and also share, what I found with the teacher. So, it's just that relationship piece is also important there, right? So that when you are invited to witness, that you aren't just observing, taking notes, and leaving, writing up your report, and that's it. It's really about changing what's happening in schools, and especially for our Black students who look around and just can't find themselves anywhere, probably. And I'm not trying to, create a monolithic view of Black students, but anywhere but like in the sports, or, you know, um, or in detention, So it's just so important that we share what we find, that we witness, and then we reflect, and that we share just our critiques and what we know can work.
Latrice, if I can follow up, because I'm so, well, let me say, one of the things I so appreciate about our marginal syllabus conversations like this, when we have partner authors who can really contextualize their scholarship, is that we learn things from you today that may not have appeared in this very rigorously peer-reviewed and again award-winning article. You shared with us, for example, that your own daughter attended this school because of your participation as the professor in residence. Unless I'm mistaken, I don't believe that detail, though many others, of course, did appear in the piece. And so now you've mentioned, multi-year engagement. And as you said, many roles that you've played formally and likely also many informally as well within this broader community, which of course extends far beyond the brick and mortar walls of the school itself. And so I first of all, I'm just so appreciative of kind of learning about that kind of broader way in which you are now situated in this kind of rich fabric of these various kind of learning environments. To get then to Joe's observation and these questions and your comments as well, Latrise, about engaging them with other teachers, I anticipate that you've had conversation with other educators in this school about the work that you've done, but perhaps also certainly the learning of students, and particularly, again, their kind of writing and their writing of their identities and their writing of their narratives. And I'm just curious, given again the kind of printed constraints of a single article, might you share with us a little glimpse of any of those additional conversations maybe that you've had with other educators at the high school, kind of that reflects this expansiveness of writing and literacy that has really taken shape because of your efforts?
Thank you so much for that question. So I think of several things. In 2017, I published an article through RTE. It also won a Purves Award. Sorry. But it was about a writing club, and it focused on the queer students who were in this space because I identify as a Black queer woman. And part of the space just ended up being this wonderful after school space. We ate together, we wrote together, danced together, all sorts of things. And a lot of teachers were afraid of the space. It was very, the population of students, a lot of them identified as queer, or gay or lesbian. We were playing music, it's just a lot of things where teachers might be like, oh, what's happening in there? They're talking about gay stuff and they're playing this music and they're dancing and they're eating. And so, okay, so all of that. But because of the relationship that I had with teachers, and they trusted me as someone who wanted the best for students, and they've seen me year after year come back, it didn't become an issue. And so part of that space, though, created this environment where queer students, they trusted me. And so teachers would send students to me. I've had an interaction with a student that was very, I wrote about this too, very disturbing. He had, cursed at a student who identified as gay and had said some very homophobic things, but I took him and we talked, and I reminded him that I am also queer. And so it's all, so literacy, it's everything. It's the being too, right? Because they trust me as this doctor, professor, lady who talks about reading, writing, and things, but also as someone who they can entrust to do right by their students. And so, it's just, all of that is just a part of the development of what I have been able to do as professor in residence for literacy in this space, including professional development, but not didactic. And it was, very interactive, but teachers, and very dialogic, right? Because I have seen what's happening. I've also practiced with them. I've taught lessons, and I send my pre-service teachers to them. And this is a school where when I first got to UA, no none of the pre-service teachers did their student teaching in this school because they had heard the rumors about the fights in the halls and the terrible students, and they're never in class. But when I got there, kids were in class, some of them maybe sleep or whatever, but that happens everywhere. But it was just a regular school. So being there also brought other folks to say, oh, yes, this is great. So now my white pre-service teachers aren't afraid to be in this space because, here we are, we've created this environment where this sort of exchange, this sort of trust has become a part of what I do as a literacy educator.
I kind of want to just have you keep going on that idea of trust, because you brought it up in terms of your conversations and your relationship with teachers. And it sounds like there's a certain amount of trust that is required in order to move practice, certainly. But that ultimately, when it comes down to it, you're also arguing that we need to trust our students and trust their perspectives. So I would love to hear more about how that can look in a classroom and how that looked in your classroom specifically.
Thank you, Hillary. Yes, so I knew that, or I have witnessed several times how, researchers go into a space, research it, and then exit. And so I didn't want to be that, only because go back to this idea of trust, right? I trust the relationship that I've gotten. I mean, the education that I've gotten. So I went to a Black high school and was very close to my teachers. I went to HBCU, Morris Brown in Atlanta. I was at the house of my professors, and really it was about relationships and talking and, trusting each other in that way. Also, this is kind of tangentially related, but trusting what I know. And so, my content in African-American literature, African-American culture, Black writing, all of these things, I'm pretty strong in that. And so I trust that I know what I'm talking about. And I trust that my ancestor knew what they were talking about. So just so that having that content knowledge also allows me to be trustworthy, and so I'm not convincing folks to follow or to do by telling them lies like, oh, you got to learn American English and you'll be successful. Like, that's a lie. And we know that. We've seen that that's not necessarily true for everybody. Or that you have to let a part of your Black self go in order to be successful, right? And so I used to straighten my hair a long time, to fit into at UA, right? And so just these ideas, so trusting that who we are is good enough for who we are. Like, we don't have to be anything other than who we are. And so I show my students this. I'm the same way, professionally, personally, like that you can trust that what I'm telling you, I practiced, I've read about it. And so, part of that content too is that I'm prepared for this. I've prepared for this. And I'm not just relying on what my teacher told me about the Great Gatsby to teach it to you. That I'm actually still in the process of learning and doing and investigating and inquiring. And we have to model that. And so students have to trust you. And the way that you gain trust is that you be trustworthy. And that takes work. It takes you reading and writing and doing the stuff of learning and thinking and giving them access to you doing these things, right? Modeling. So that they trust that, oh, if I do this, then I could possibly maybe be somebody, or I could, they are somebody, but, do something more with my life, right? That isn't, I have to sell a part of myself in order to reach some height, but they can be exactly who they are. But that does entail knowing some stuff, doing some stuff, you know. Um, I have gone on and on about trust, but I think it's such an important question, and an important part of who we have to be as thinkers and learners, model learners, right? We're not just teachers, but we're modeling learning. And so if we're not doing that, and if you're not really engaging in that, then yeah, students not going to trust you for any of it. And so it's just not enough to bring in a Black author that's popular on TikTok or whatever. You have to do the work too. And so when they see that, children will give you their worlds, they'll reveal their worlds to you in writing and rap and singing and dancing and twirling the flag. And I've seen it over and over and over again.
This may seem like such a letdown of a question after such a beautiful response about trust. Although again, I'm really impressed. There's a kind of embodied sense of, your presence in the school, your connections with students, again, as you were just saying, trustworthiness. So this question may just seem so trite and kind of obvious given the moment that we're in, but I feel as though many educators are wrestling with the various disconnections of the moment. A year plus deep into a pandemic in which the locations of learning have shifted dramatically, but so too has that sense of trust. And I guess I'm curious how, the high school, West High School, is that right? And specifically, but also, your broader community has been navigating some of the challenges of the moment, particularly, really dual pandemics. We may call them multiple pandemics, those of course related to public health, but also racial justice and ongoing forms of trauma that are just lingering across communities in the country at the moment, and how you've been perhaps with your colleagues been able to maintain trust when so much disconnection and perhaps mistrust has certainly defined this academic year.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because this context has made it very difficult. But being in America for these last 40 something years, America's always been traumatic for folks. Like, even at its beginning, like it started on trauma. And violence and just, hostile takeovers. And so several things, or a couple of things. So this idea, that we're going through this, kind of racial uprising. We have to deal with that, in ways that are honest, authentic. Sometimes we can't deal with it every day, because talking about it and, doing the work is also stirring up trauma, right? And so you just have to be purposeful about how and when you're having these difficult conversations with students, with teachers, but also being understanding, that talking to me about a standardized test in this moment just doesn't feel right. When you're in a relationship with somebody you love and y'all had an argument or something that's terrible happened, you're not bringing up some contractual agreement. You're really just dealing with the thing that's in front of you. And so, or the person that's in front of you, right? Talk about humanizing, just interactions. So part of that is, yet we're not new to trauma and to, unrest in America. I think that we're just at this part of the cycle where things are just like wild and people are tired and they're mad, they're upset. And so part of it is, yes, dealing with those moments, making sure that you're checking in with students and making sure that they're okay. But and not being able to be close to them also brings in another kind of it makes it hard, right? But I also think that this, dealing with this and answering the call of like online teaching and, still trying to be here for your students, the things that ground your teaching in person should also ground your teaching online. So many people find excuses about why they can't do this and what I can do because of this, pandemic. Oh, it's not a pandemic, but it's a pandemic because of the pandemic. But the things that ground my teaching are community. We need to do some writing. We need to do some reading. We need to do some sharing. And so these things, I just have to figure out how to do them online. And so I have, I figured out how to edit the master in Google Slides and make handouts. And, we're doing Zoom and getting together. And also, I've been texting a lot of students who have graduated and just checking in, making sure that they're fine and that they're okay. And so also when teachers are kind of making excuses about why they can't do the thing, like I get it, I do, I understand totally. You just have to remind them, look, the things that ground who you are, that ground your practice needs to always ground your practice. And so just figure out, and I've also try to figure out ways to be supportive and helping them, come up with assignments and, creative ways to get them talking, to come off mute. But we just have to deal with these moments and not make excuses for why we can't answer the call. We've been answering the call through all sorts of trauma, including racial trauma. And so we just have to continue to press on.
I had maybe one additional question. Thinking about implications for teachers who are teaching more heterogeneous populations. So at West, it's predominantly Black students. What are implications for folks who are teaching maybe a smaller number of African American students or none at all? How do they bring this into their classroom?
That's a great question, Hillary. That is the question. And so it kind of goes back to this idea that I'm not just bringing in Black literature because I got Black students. I have studied Black literature and Black texts and Black authors, and I respect the ways that they do text, for different reasons, right? And so what we have to do is, no matter who we're teaching, right? The Black experience is the American experience. It's a part of it. And so we have to remind our students, whoever they are, that, yeah, we're not just reading this because it's a Black book or because it deals with Black issues, right? These are our issues. These are our issues that we need to grapple with together regardless. And, the same ways that we talk about Shakespeare and the beautiful language that he has been able to create and invent, right? Do that for Black authors who have done the same thing. I think about Lil Wayne, which I'm not really trying to mess with him right now because, Trump, but, I think about how he's created language. And so we do the same things with language because it's universal to our humanness. And so whoever you're teaching, I'm bringing these texts in here because I believe in them. My content knowledge is strong in them. I can teach you how to analyze, synthesize, evaluate all those verbs that we have to do in Bloom's taxonomy. I can do all of that with whatever text that is in front of me. And that is what a strong teacher does. They're not just bringing in literature because, oh, you know, these things are happening in the world. We need some literature to reflect that. It's very important to do that, but it needs to be an integral part of the everyday teaching and learning that we do, regardless of our population. These texts have something very rich to add to who we are, all of us as literate beings. And so we have to be diligent in learning what those texts are, exploring what those texts are, and really, you know, gaining the knowledge we need to be able to model for our students the thinking and the learning around those texts, regardless of who our students are.
So I so much appreciate this conversation as we're kind of nearing the 1 hour mark. So we're at a good point to close it off. And so I want to just invite folks to maybe share one big takeaway. And again, thank you, Latrise, for sharing so much of the thinking and the backstory behind this awesome piece that we're looking forward to annotating and discussing online during the month of April. So thank you so much. And then I want to invite last questions from or last takeaways from Remi, Hillary, and then I'll share what I'm walking away with as well.
I'll just say thank you so much again, Latrise, and please pass again our sincere note of gratitude along to Hannah as well, and again Hillary for joining us as our reader in our conversation today. You know, there's this just a beautiful line towards the end of the piece about inviting students to write themselves into teaching and learning landscapes, and I'm gonna just sit with that and share that and think on that and also annotate that as we move parts of this conversation into a kind of a digital companion online over, you know, the weeks and maybe months to come. But thank you again so much for sharing your wisdom with the Marginal Syllabus community.
I am walking away with so much, but I think I love that its rootedness in the writing itself, and all the ways that writing and conversation about writing can show up and can be encouraged to show up even in digital spaces. So thank you so much for your work. Thank you, Hannah, as well. And thank you for allowing me to be here and participate.
Thank you all so much. You've all given me so much to think about, you know, with this work. It's always going and, you know, changing and changing according to context and whoever I'm teaching at the moment. But I really appreciate the ways that you've read me, you know, and then read the work. I'm so grateful to be able to share with others in this. And also, am I allowed to participate in the annotation?
Always. Very welcome. Very welcome.
Yeah, very much so. And if you have any questions about how to do that, we'll be happy to help you. And I think my last thought is just I'm just so appreciative, kind of to jump back to Remi's question about the pandemic and all that our country is grappling with right now. And just I think this piece gives me hope because of, you know, the way it revisits the potential for creative writing and what texts might do when they, you know, when the texts we choose can act as mentors. And you know, I very much we could have talked more about it, but some of my favorite moments were just the allusions to what the assignments were, which were very, you know, departures from some traditional instruction, also with rich examples of student voice. And so just an appreciation for how creative writing seems to have such potential to do powerful, important work for students in this moment, and the idea that we can, you know, think anew with some powerful mentor texts that will serve particularly Black students. And this piece is such an awesome guide for helping us think more about that and take risks in doing so. So thank you so much, Latrise. Thank you, Hillary, for joining us, and thanks everyone who's watching. Finally, so last word here is that revealing the human and the writer, the promise of a humanizing writing pedagogy for Black students, will be online during April and accessible for participant annotations at educatorinnovator.org. Please follow us using the hashtag Marginal Syllabus. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
NWP Radio.
You're listening to NWP Radio, a production of the National Writing Project.
NWP. NWP Radio.